Welcome everyone to week 2 of our series on Israel and Palestine, how we talk about the conflict. So we are learning to think about the words we use and how they have impact, how the connotations, not just the meaning of the word, but the connotations of the words affect how we frame the conversation according to different perspectives. So last week, week 1, we learned a little bit of basic history of the region, and we learned about multiple narratives about the conflict. Now that class recording is already up on our Fourth Church YouTube page, so if you missed that class or you want to review, you can check out those topics. So now we think about, if our task is peacemaking, how can we work for peace? If we care about justice, how can we work for justice? And if we believe in reconciliation, how can we play a role in reconciliation? So these are kind of some of the motivations behind our interest and our attention into thinking about how we talk about the conflict. So there are many contested words and narratives and strategies about the conflict. And here are a few of them flashing across the screen. Apartheid, anti-Semitism, oops, go back there one. Racism, colonialism, questions of who belongs to the land or who does the land belong to, could be a different way to say it. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So we're going to take a little bit of a look today at a few of these issues, and next week we're going to dig in a little more deeply into the boycott, divestment, and sanctions aspect. Next week we're going to get much more deeply into actual Presbyterian overtures and resolutions and statements that the denomination has made and some of the controversies about those. But today we're talking a little more big picture about how we and many people talk about the conflict in a more general way. So who are these peoples? Whose land is it? We've talked about there being two narratives. Here's one way to talk about the two narratives. Is this conflict an example of colonial oppression, where European Jews are oppressing indigenous people, Palestinians? That's the way that some people talk about it. Or is this a geopolitical conflict between two nationalist peoples? So are Jews foreigners who are coming into this land to extract value and labor? Colonialism? That's the one narrative. Or are both Jews and Palestinians rooted in this land? What do we believe? How do we talk about it? Who are the people and whose land is it? Who belongs to the land? One of the resources that I have found helpful is another piece from Vox. Last week our basic 10-minute history thing was from Vox. You don't have to read all that tiny print, but this is on the handout for today if you want to go to this website and click through some of these myths about Israel-Palestine. I find Vox to be a pretty reliable educational website that links to lots of information. So I'm going to zoom in on what they list as myth number 5 here. Myth number 5, the idea that Palestinians aren't a real nationality or Israelis aren't a real nationality. The pro-Palestinian argument for this is that Israelis are actually European Jews who trumped up an idea of an Israeli identity in order to steal land, but who actually belong in Europe and need to go back. That's like an extreme representation of that perspective, but people believe that. And this is very tied to the idea that Israel is a colonialist enterprise of Europeans coming and colonizing, being imperialists. And then the pro-Israeli argument on the other side says Palestinians are just Arabs who trumped up the idea of a Palestinian identity in order to claim land that they weren't fully using, but who should instead be absorbed into the neighboring Arab states of Jordan and Egypt. So Palestinians didn't really start talking about being Palestinians until the 1960s, when there was a lot of this developing ideas of national identity. So let's think a little bit about nationality identities. This is from Vox still. They say, well, the American national identity didn't exist 300 years ago. There was no such thing as a US citizen. The Nigerian national identity did not exist 100 years ago. But those identities are relatively modern inventions stitched together from prior identities, prior groupings of people, and land claims in certain places. But we all agree that the American identity is real and valid, and the Nigerian identity is real. There are Nigerian people, there are American people, there are US people. So if you Google around about this, you can find articles that try to address this in different ways. Here's an article from 2014, Do Palestinians Really Exist? And it's written by a Palestinian who's making the point that yes, Palestinians exist, it's an identity, it's legitimate. His little tagline here on this article is, we're not all terrorists, we're not cockroaches, and we are certainly not an invented people. What you don't know about Palestinians. So he has this article talking about his Palestinian experience. And I put in tiny print here on the side a story that he tells about being 9 years old in the 1970s, and his teacher asking the ethnicity of each student in the class so she could put a pin in a map. But she didn't know where Palestine was. She hadn't heard of Palestinians. This was in the 1970s. So he tells the story that luckily he was half Sicilian, so she could put him on the Italy map. But he went home and talked to his dad about it and said, where is Palestine? And his dad paused for a moment as he gathered his thoughts, he wrote, and he touched his heart and his head and responded, in here. Palestine is in here. Which is a beautiful experience between a father and his son about identity, national identity, community. And yet we also know Palestine is also on the map and is a physical place. It's not just in here. Here's an article asking the question, are Jews indigenous to the land of Israel? This author says yes. There are papers and articles about, well, what does it really mean to be indigenous? Something to do with ancestry, belonging to a particular land, a language spoken, a culture spoken. Some people say Jews are not indigenous. If we think about history, here's some Bible maps that on the left show the 12 tribes of Israel, and on the right shows the kingdom of Israel and the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of Judah. This is during the time of the Assyrian Empire, and you can see Assyrian Empire written up in the top corner of the map. So there's something historical about Jews, Jewish existence in this land. The name Israel has been used before. Here's a map from 1759. The text here is a translation of, I believe it's Latin, the Latin inscription up there on the upper right. This is a map of, quote, the Holy Land or Palestine, showing not only the old kingdoms of Judea in the south and Israel in the north, but also the 12 tribes distinctly, confirming their locations diversely in their ancient condition and doing so as the Holy Scriptures indicate. 1759. So how does ancestry fit into this? How does heritage fit into an identity of peoplehood? So going back to the Vox article about real nationalities, they acknowledge Israelis and Palestinians do have ancient heritages. But these identities, these heritages, the identities compared, the heritage are there. That's the history. The identities are modern inventions, but so are other national identities. And they say the world is organized on an idea called national self-determination, which says people are allowed to determine their own national identity and then organize politically around it. So they say Israelis and Palestinians clearly see themselves as holding a strong national identity. So the world should respect that, while this national self-determination tries to get worked out between these two peoples. But that's our challenge, these two narratives, colonial oppression or geopolitical conflict between two nationalist peoples. That's one way of describing the dual narrative. Another way of describing the dual narrative is this conflict a system of injustice with a villain and victims, or is this a struggle for self-determination between two peoples for a homeland? We saw in the history video about the Palestine Liberation Organization. We saw in the history video about the 5 Arab nations coming together and trying to push out Israel when it was just being founded, trying to overcome them. But Israel won that war. So if it's a struggle for self-determination between two peoples for a homeland, what happens when one people gains the upper hand? So Israel won a war and got some land. Is it still a struggle between two peoples for a homeland? Or is it no longer a struggle for sovereignty? Does the one who wins the war now become the villain? I guess that probably depends on how they act. But do we say that it's no longer a struggle for sovereignty, for national identity? So I give these different scenarios and these different ways of talking about it to continue to explore how does our language about it affect how we see the people involved in the struggle. How does our language about it affect how we see the people involved in the struggle? So getting into some controversial words about it. This is a new report that was just issued. I think it came out in February, maybe early March, but I think February, from Amnesty International. This is the title page. Israel's apartheid against Palestinians, cruel system of domination and crime against humanity. This report is 280 pages long, and the executive summary is 27 pages long. So I'm just starting to process this in some ways. I could not get this all together in my head and get to the place where I could say in my own words reactions to this very long report. But I am going to try to bring you some ideas and thoughts about it, some commentary, and some of the controversy around this. Of course, Amnesty International, I mean, most of us trust them as a very reliable social justice organization. So when they put out a report like this, we take it pretty seriously. We have to really study it and analyze it. More and more people are using the term apartheid about the occupation, and that is very controversial. We're going to dig into that specific word a little bit. There are other controversial terms that we've been touching on, the colonialism, the claim that it's colonialism, or that it's settler colonialism, a particular kind of colonialism, or that Israel is racist, that Zionism is a kind of racism because it's trying to make a land for a particular people group, and so it gets defined as a kind of racism. There's claims that Israel is engaged in ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in the region. So I've turned to a scholar to bring us some comments and some questions to think about in this. This gentleman who has a book called Israel Denial, Anti-Zionism, Anti-Semitism, and the Faculty Campaign Against the Jewish State. So what I'm going to bring is some quotes from an article that he's written about this Amnesty International report. So in his perspective, he has a section of his article, and I put the link to this article in the handout, so you can pick it out when you leave, and people on Zoom remind me to paste that link in your chat box so you can download this. So he has a whole section of his response called Racializing the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict Radically Distorts Our Understanding of It. I apologize for the heavy text-based nature of the next few slides, but this was the only way I knew how to get this to you. It's so dense. So he makes this point that apartheid was preeminently a racialized phenomena, he's kind of defining his terms, With skin color the key marker of racial difference, even though skin color is at best genetically trivial. So he's making the point that race as a biological category is kind of made up. But racism and the way race is presented in society has a very powerful, very real effect. So genetically trivial, but huge in terms of social relations and our concerns about racism. So then he makes the point that the Jews and Arabs of the Middle East offer no basis for racial differentiation. So when half of Israeli Jews are descended from populations in Arab countries, then the option of differentiating Jews and Palestinians racially has long been non-existent. So we can get stuck into the idea that Jews come from Europe, but many, many Jews come from throughout the Middle East, the Arab countries. So there's not a racial distinction in that sense. He says also if Arabs and Palestinians are peoples of color, then so are Israeli Jews descended from historic communities in Iraq and elsewhere throughout the Middle East. So some Israelis can be designated as white, just as some Arabs can be designated as white, but the distinctions are superficial. So he acknowledges there is racism in Israel, though, and there is substantial anti-Semitic racism in the Arab world. But racism hasn't been the defining basis of the regional conflicts. The regional conflicts have been framed around different things, but that's why one reason many people resist defining the Israeli policies as being apartheid or as being racially based. The report, Amnesty International, gives an expansive definition, and they say they have an understanding of race as a social construct that encompasses issues such as color, descent, or national or ethnic origin. So that expands the definition quite a bit, and that definition is promoted by a UN committee called the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So this opens up the possibility for Israel and the Palestinians to be included in this racialized concept, but it also opens up questions like, so are the French a race? Not really. You know, is this ethnic group a race? Not really. So the definitions here leave a lot of ambiguity and openness about what the definition means. So he describes the South African apartheid system. They had there an elaborate set of discriminatory laws covering virtually every aspect of social and political life. Israel has nothing of the kind. Israel has basic laws and multiple court decisions guaranteeing equality within its pre-1967 borders. No matter, he says, according to Amnesty, a racialized system can be unknown to its perpetrators, enshrined nowhere in law or policy. So, you know, his point is apartheid South Africa had laws that enforced this segregation. There is nothing like that. In Israel, in the boundaries of Israel, they have this democracy. We talked last week a little bit about, is it a fair democracy, or are there human rights and justices within that democracy? And then there's the occupied territories, which is very different. There aren't the same basic rights for the Palestinians who are not Israeli citizens. So remember, some Palestinians are Israeli citizens protected by the Israeli human rights laws, but the Palestinians in the occupied territories are not citizens, and we would hope they would one day be citizens of a Palestinian state. But in the meantime, there's this military conflict. So I would have thought that Amnesty would be making the point that in the occupied territories, there's nevertheless a system of separating people that seems like apartheid. But they are also claiming that it's happening inside Israel's 1967 boundaries too, which I find surprising, to put it mildly. Yes?
I thought that within the bounds of Israel, Palestinians don't have the same voting rights as the Jewish citizens. And there are people in Israel, and there are people who are citizens of Jerusalem, and I know there are Palestinians who are citizens of Jerusalem, and therefore they have certain rights that the Palestinians in the occupied territories do not have. But I'm not sure, I know there's all kinds of differentiation about voting rights too, and things like that.
Yes, I'm not sure about voting rights. I know there is a differentiation on who can run to serve, but there are Arab people serving on the Knesset. So I don't know. I know there are some second-class citizen issues. I think that's very different from apartheid. Because being treated as a second-class citizen is bad, but I do think there are degrees. I think the way that the people in South Africa, the black majority, were kept segregated and not given access to resources, I think it's different. I think it's a difference of scale. So we can get into more conversation about it now, but maybe let's keep going and then we'll have more conversation at the end. Thank you, though, for bringing that up. It's true. This is not, I don't mean to be painting this as this is simple and there's no injustice. There is injustice and there are human rights abuses. But is it apartheid? And why is it important to some people to use the term apartheid? It triggers certain things when people hear about it. So that's kind of what I'm getting at, like how we talk about it and the words we use are done on purpose to trigger certain reactions.
Has that word been used anywhere other than in South Africa? Apartheid? I mean, I only connect it with South Africa.
I think it started in South Africa, but the UN then created some policies about apartheid, so it may be assigned to other locations. I'm not sure. That's at the edge of my knowledge.
Well, it's in this Amnesty International report, isn't it? Aren't they calling it apartheid?
Well, now, yeah, so she's saying this is the first time it's being applied to a different country, we think.
I was trying to figure out if there was some other
Yeah.
use that I was unaware of.
I think it's the first, this country is the first country. It's not the first time that this word has been used. It was used in a Human Rights Watch report a year ago in 2021. And there's other history. I don't have all the dates, times. So another thing from Amnesty International's report, they write, I think this is a quote from the report, instead of assessing separately whether or not Israel has perpetrated the international wrong and the crime against humanity in each of the territories under its control, Amnesty International has analyzed the system of institutionalized discrimination against Palestinians as a whole. So this is from the Amnesty report, and this is Kerry Nelson's response. He says that means the oppressive contributions Hamas and the Palestinian Authority make to living conditions are irrelevant because then Israel's system overrides them. The Palestinians suffering from discrimination in Lebanon are really under Israel's thumb. That's what this makes this sound. It's saying Israel is responsible for the oppression of all Palestinians everywhere, including Palestinians in diaspora who no longer live in the region, and including descendants of Palestinians living in diaspora. That Israel is guilty of crimes against humanity against all those Palestinians in all those locations. So Amnesty International's report concludes that the State of Israel considers and treats Palestinians as an inferior non-Jewish racial group. So they're calling Jewish racial and not Jewish a different racial group. This is Amnesty's definitions. That they're calling it a group with particular attributes that is different from other non-Jewish groups. You can see how this is so dense. There's all these definitions in the report. The report says the State of Israel has targeted the Palestinian population as a whole on the basis of their non-Jewish identity and national status. and on the basis of their racialized non-Jewish Arab status, but not the same as all Arabs, just specifically Palestinians. So Carrie Nelson's comment is this formulation goes beyond indicting Israel to indict Judaism itself for a non-existent racist inclination to see itself as superior to other religious and national groups. It is one of the ways the Amnesty report crosses a line into anti-Semitism. So there's been a lot of talk lately about the idea of chosenness. And this idea gets brought up in arguments that Israel is a colonialist endeavor, that the Jews are saying they're chosen people, and so they're claiming this land and they're saying they're chosen and they're better than everybody else. And this Amnesty report is kind of picking up some of those same thoughts and understandings of what it means to be chosen people. Now, we also consider ourselves to be chosen people, Presbyterians, and we talk about it in a way similar to the way that many, many Jews talk about chosenness. That we're chosen not because we're superior, but we're chosen to be a blessing to the world. Through us and our descendants, the world would be blessed. Chosen to be a blessing. Not chosen to be superior, not chosen to be dominators. And that's where, if it starts saying that, well, Judaism, because Jews think they're chosen, therefore that means this, that they're supremacists, they're Jewish supremacists, so that word is starting to get put out as well. Sort of tying Zionism to white supremacy. And that's something that goes through this Amnesty International report as well. So I have provided the link to this very dense article. And there's another resource I want to point out, which is an article that appeared in The Atlantic last fall called Palestine Isn't Ferguson. And this article analyzes the race claims. And the last line in the article is Palestine isn't Ferguson, Israel isn't South Africa, and Zionism isn't white supremacy. But that author analyzes all of those claims and how the critique of Israeli policy is getting merged in with these other very important social ills and evils. But if we fail to be able to distinguish between the different harms that are done, we can't as effectively understand what's going on, and we can't as effectively address it. This other blurb here under the Palestine Isn't Ferguson is their header of how they describe what the article's about. Any useful analysis of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict requires engaging with an unresolved, frustratingly complex struggle between two national movements, each with a justified claim to the land. Now, in that struggle, there have been wars, there have been death, there have been refugees, there continues to be human rights abuses. But the concern is to say that how we talk about it matters. There are human rights abuses that need to be addressed. And we can address them without turning it into a villain-victims scenario. And we can identify the villainous things that are done in the situation. We can support Israel and fight the occupation. This is a graphic from Peace Now. It's an Israeli peace movement. And, they want to lift up this idea that to end the occupation is to support Israel. In the Amnesty International report, and in the reports that start merging Zionism with white supremacy, it seems like there is a move to say that Israel's existence itself is racist, which would lead to the end of Israel's existence altogether. It's ideological to say that Israel is colonialist outsiders and they need to leave, or they are white supremacists and they need to give up any claim to the land they think they have based on their heritage or their identity. But can we address the occupation and the human rights abuses without saying that the existence of Israel is a white supremacist action? I hope we can. Peace Now is trying to. Peace Now is Israeli citizens who believe that the pursuit of peace, compromise, and reconciliation with the Palestinians and with the Arab states is necessary to guarantee Israel's future security and its identity as a state. And that the continued military and civilian control of the West Bank and over 3 million Palestinians that reside within it jeopardizes the fundamental existence and the democratic character of Israel as the state of the Jewish people. So Peace Now, like other peace organizations, is calling Israel to its highest ideals, pointing out where they're failing, addressing human rights abuses, organizing and demonstrating to pressure for this kind of an outcome. But they're not questioning Israel's right to exist as a democracy with a Jewish character. But they're saying, we haven't achieved it yet, and we need to do better. Another organization that's working is called Roots. And this is a group based in Israel that's fostering a grassroots movement of understanding nonviolence and transformation among Israelis and Palestinians. That's how they describe themselves. Last week we heard a talk from Ali Abu Awad. We listened to a little bit of his TED talk on how he, as a Palestinian, first learned that Jews cry and that Jews have feelings. He didn't really believe that Jews did have feelings because all he knew was the military occupation, and he had been imprisoned in Israeli jails. And he came to that awareness through his involvement with bereaved families, circle, and meeting people from the other side who had lost loved ones. Well, he also is a co-founder of Roots, and it's his family land where this organization is based. And working with him is Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger, who is an Orthodox rabbi and a teacher and a passionate Zionist settler. So he's living in occupied territories in a Jewish settlement. But he has been profoundly transformed and tells a story about his encounter with Palestinians. And this is from a description of an event when he was speaking at Wheaton College. I think that was in 2016. So the 2 years ago really means 2014. But I would like to show, I'm checking the time, I would like to show a 14-minute clip of him describing his process. I think it will help us, it helped me understand how Jews feel connected to the land. They're passionate about that. And then I have another little quote from Ali Abu Awad, his co-worker, and we can open up for conversation after that. So let's try to watch this video.
How could it be that for 33 years, I've lived my life in an area where there are 9 Palestinians for each Israeli, and I'd never met even one Palestinian? How could that be? I'd like to tell you the story of how that could be. It's the story to a large degree of my life. And it's a roller coaster ride. There are hairpin turns, unexpected developments, so please don't prejudge me. The way things turn out may not be what you expect after hearing the beginning. So I want to present myself with 3 labels, 3 titles. I'm a Jew, and I'm a Zionist, and I'm a settler. When I say that I'm a Jew, it has to be very clear that I'm not only identifying myself as part of a religion, a faith community. It's that, but it's much more than that. What I'm saying primarily is I'm a member of the Jewish people, of the Jewish nation. And the minute I talk about myself as a member of the Jewish people, I go back to the book of Genesis, to chapter 12, When God says to Abraham, Lech lecha mi'artzecha, go forth from your land to the land that I will show you. And Abraham and Sarah leave Mesopotamia. They go to the land that God will show them. Turns out to be the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. And then God says, your seed I will make like the stars in heaven, like the grains of sand on the seashore, and the myriad of your descendants will inherit this land for eternity. And what that means is that my consciousness as a Jew, as a member of the Jewish nation, bounds me up essentially and integrally with the land of Israel. Whether it turns out to be politically expedient or comfortable or not, the Jewish identity is bound up with the land of Israel. And when I talk about myself with the Jewish people, I also have to make another point, which is my birth certificate. It says I was born in 1957, but I wasn't. I was born 3,000 years ago. I was born in the pages of Genesis chapter 12 when God calls upon Abraham. And I have a sense that I was there. It's part of my DNA. And just like I was there from the very beginning, I have a sense that I have a stake in. I was there for all the further stages of Jewish history as described in the pages of the Bible, and then later on in the continuing saga of the Jewish people. I am a link in a chain, but I'm more than just a link in a chain. Every single link in the chain is part of my internal identity. It's an expanded identity, a collective identity, not just individual identity. And then I said that after I'm a Jew, I'm a Zionist. Today, I think that something like 90% of Jews around the world, at least those over 30, consider themselves to be Zionists. But the question is, what is a Zionist? Every Jew has a slightly different definition. When I say that I'm a Zionist, what I'm thinking is the following. A Zionist is a Jew that understands and has internalized that at the end of the 19th century and since then, God has presented to the Jewish people the opportunity to reconsummate our connection to our ancient homeland, and we have to seize hold of that opportunity. Because for 2,000 years, since the year 70 of the Common Era, when the Romans destroyed the Second Jewish Commonwealth and razed the temple to the ground, they sent us into an exile to the four corners of the universe that we've been in for 2,000 years. And during the time of this diaspora, we have been yearning and hoping and praying next year in Jerusalem. The day will come back, we pray and beseech God that we will again be back in the land, and we'll be back in the land as a sovereign nation, ruling ourselves, creating the vibrant Jewish culture that grows out of the Holy Land of Israel. Now, I was born in New York. I wasn't born in Israel. But when I was 18, I picked up my bags and I did what we call in Hebrew, I made aliyah, I ascended to the land, because I had a sense that that's where things are happening. That's where the Jewish people are recreating themselves. That's where we are actually writing the next page in the Bible. That's where everything is alive. For 2,000 years, while in exile, we haven't been just in physical exile, in geographical exile. We have been in existential exile. Our Judaism has just been holding on for dear life. It's like been treading water and waiting for the day when we can live it as we're supposed to live it. But when we're not in the land, that's not the Judaism that God envisioned for the Jewish people. I like to think of Jewish history, the saga of Jewish continuity, as a movie. It's a full-length feature documentary that was filmed in the land of Israel, and then 2,000 years ago, God pushed the pause button, and all the actors have been in suspended animation waiting to start again. And just in this generation, 100 years ago, and continuing today, the movie is being filmed again, and I was called upon to be a major player in it. So how could I not say yes to that demand? And I really have a great sense of opportunity and merit that my ancestors who lived in the lands of exile in northern Africa and in Mesopotamia and in Europe and today in America, they don't have. I have the opportunity to play a central role in this divine human drama. That's a little bit of what I mean when I say that I'm a Zionist. When I say that I'm a settler, well, a settler is defined as an Israeli, a Jewish Israeli, who doesn't live in Israel proper, the Israel from 1948 to 1967, but rather lives beyond the 1948-67 line in what's called the West Bank. So the map is on the board. Israel of the coast in something like yellow. You can see there in the north, Akko, Haifa, it goes down to Hadera, Netanya, there's Tel Aviv, then there's Ashdod. That's Israel proper. And then over to your right in blue is the West Bank. So a settler is an Israeli Jew who lives in the West Bank. When I say that I'm a settler living where I live, for many it sounds like I'm making a political statement, even a radical, perhaps even a dangerous political statement. But my intention is not to make a political statement, it's to make a historical statement. And I'll explain that in a moment. But first I'm going to dig my grave even deeper and say something that perhaps sounds even more dangerous and radical, which is that the place I live, which the map calls the West Bank, I don't call the West Bank. I call it Judea and Samaria. Judea being the land south of Jerusalem, and Samaria being the land north of Jerusalem. I call it what I call it for the same reason that I live there, because of the historical continuity. The Jewish people were born in Judea and Samaria. The book of Genesis takes place in Judea and Samaria. The book of Joshua, the book of Judges, the book of Samuel, the books of Kings take place primarily in Judea and Samaria. And why do I call it that? Because that's what the Bible calls it. The Bible doesn't say that King David ruled in the West Bank. It says that King David ruled in Judea. And why is it called Judea? Because that was the area of the inheritance of the tribe of Judah. That's the area south of Jerusalem. North of Jerusalem we call Samaria because the Bible calls it that, the kingdom of the 10 tribes. The 10 northern tribes, the capital of the kingdom was a city called Samaria, and the whole kingdom was called Samaria, in Hebrew, Shomron. Why should I call it the West Bank? King Hussein and his father created that term just in the past 50, 60, 70 years. I live there because of the sense of connectivity, because of that chain of tradition. Where I live, you can walk outside my house, 5 or 10 minute walk in a number of different directions, go and scrape your heel on the ground and come up with potsherds that my ancestors left 2,000 years ago. That sense of historical continuity is really powerful. There's a trail right by my house. It goes north-south. In the north begins in Megiddo all the way down to Beersheba. And we found on it a Roman milestone, only a 10-minute walk from my house, that says 11 Roman miles from Jerusalem. And if it was the ancient Roman road north-south 2,000 years ago, then most probably it was the ancient Canaanite road 3,000 years ago. If it was the ancient Canaanite road 3,000 years ago, then that's the road that Abraham walked upon with Isaac when God called upon him to walk 3 days to the mountain I will show you and sacrifice your son upon what became known as Mount Moriah, Jerusalem. Abram walked on that path, and that path is right near my backyard. That's really powerful. And on that same path, we have discovered, excavated, ancient mikvaot, ancient ritual baths carved in the limestone in Second Temple period 2,000 years ago. The baths fill with water in the winter, with rainwater. And it's a place that you can immerse yourself. It's like a bathtub. Pilgrims coming from the south 2,000 years ago, at the time that the Second Temple existed, on their way to worship there in the temple for Passover, for Shavuot, Pentecost, and for the Holiday of Tabernacles, Sukkot, they stopped there in those mikvot, those ancient ritual baths, to immerse themselves and become pure on the way to worshiping God in the temple. All that is where I live. And you know, 90% of my neighbors, the Jewish settlers of Judea, they're religious Jews, biblical Jews, connected to the past as I am. We often go out into the fields with a Bible to experience, not just in the classroom, but in real life, where Abraham walked, where David and Goliath had their battles. It's alive, it's true, it's powerful. We can see the ancient fortresses of David, of King David. Wow. That animates my being. And my sense is that the power, the righteousness, the justice, the truth of the story that I just told you, my story, the power of that story has blinded me my whole life to another story, the story of the Palestinians. I didn't see them. They're 90% of the people where I live, but they were transparent. Their existence didn't register in my heart and soul because I was so bound up in my own story, my own truth. If I talked in terms earlier of a movie, that Jewish destiny and history is a full-length documentary, well, it's like the Palestinians were the gray, drab landscape passing in the background, but not part of the story. Invisible. And I want to tell you two anecdotes that illustrate that invisibility. I was in my car, this was about 2.5 years ago, and I had two Protestant pastors, one from New Jersey and one from Texas, friends of mine. They wanted to see the flourishing of Jewish settlement in Judea. They wanted to see the Bible come alive, the visions of Jeremiah, the visions of Isaiah, really coming to fruition. And I showed them with great pride the 22 settlements of the area I live in. It's called Gush Etzion, within Judea. I had room in the car, so I picked up a hitchhiker, and then another one. When the second hitchhiker got out of the car, one of the pastors said to me, he said, "Hanan, you're such a nice guy, you pick up hitchhikers. We don't do that in Texas." And I said to him, "Bob, yeah, around here we have a sense of camaraderie, we trust each other, we have a common mission, and so I pick up everyone who puts out his finger." And by the time I finished the sentence, I realized I was lying. I was lying to Bob, and I was lying to myself, because I do not pick up everyone who puts out his finger. I pick up only Jews. I'm not debating right now the question of it, whether it's right or wrong to pick up only Jews. What's bothering me at this very moment, and then 2.5 years ago, was the fact that I was able to say that I pick up every person who puts out his finger, and that's not true. There was something rotten inside that I was equating Jews and people. I didn't see that there was anyone else. And at that moment, I said to Bob, "Bob, what's wrong with me? That's rotten." And I realized that I have some spiritual work to do. And then my life changed completely. In January 2014, when for the first time in my life, I met a Palestinian. And again, a Protestant pastor comes into my story because I put out on Facebook that I never met a Palestinian, and I think that I should. And a pastor in Western Virginia by the name of John Moyle got wind of my post, and he wrote to me and said that he can help me out, help me meet Palestinians. Because it turns out he had a ministry for the past 2 years of coming to the Holy Land twice a year, meeting Palestinians, meeting Israeli settlers who live right next door, and gasp, introducing them to each other. And he said he's introduced many settlers and Palestinians to each other, he can do it again. He came to the Holy Land, sat in my living room, we talked quite a bit, and he gave me directions of where I should go next Thursday afternoon. The time came. I was in my living room with my wife, and I went to the front door and told my wife I was going out, and she said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going to meet Palestinians." And she said, "Are you crazy? They'll kill you." And she was afraid. She said, "I beg you, don't go." And I walked out the front door, and I was afraid. My heart was pounding. I didn't have to take the car. That's how close we lived to each other. I walked 20 minutes through these Palestinian orchards and vineyards, and I got to the compound, the Palestinian piece of farmland that you saw in the movie. And I peered in the metal gate, walked inside, and I saw a miracle, something that can't happen. I saw 15 Palestinians and 15 Israelis talking to each other. So Jamal, at one point in the conversation, he said to me, "Hanan, you know, when our kids see someone who looks like you, they start to cry." I said, "What's wrong with the way I live, with the way I look?" And he didn't understand why I don't understand. Then he said to me, "Hanan, the beard, the kippah, the tzitzit." I said, what's wrong with the way I look? And he said, Hanan, you don't understand. All the people who look like you, they go outside and they carry guns and they kill our kids. What was I supposed to say? And I look at him in silence, and then suddenly I realize that this is a moment of blessing. Because for the first time in my life, I'm experiencing how the other experiences me. And I'm still silent. And then another light bulb goes off in my mind, and I say to myself, I get it. Because when we, the settlers, walk outside the fence of our settlements, we sometimes carry a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other hand, because it's dangerous out there. So I said to Jamal, what do you want? We're all afraid of you. And he said, no, we're all afraid of you.
That's our excerpt for today. That's from a video called Painful Hope, Unlikely Partners for Peace. The organization Roots was giving a talk at Wheaton College in 2016. So the link is on the handout, but you could Google it too. Painful Hope, Wheaton College. It would probably pop up. It's like an hour and a half or an hour and 50 minutes long. And after Hanan tells his whole story, Ali tells his whole story about how they have learned to humanize each other and how they're struggling together about their conflicting needs for the land. And their testimony of how they've been changed is very powerful. Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger came here with Ali's brother and spoke at Fourth Church several years ago, and we'd love to have them back again to speak. When the choir trip goes there this summer, we will hopefully meet with them. That's being worked out right now, and see their place where they meet together. It's the family land of Ali Abu Awad, and it's certainly not easy. That was excerpts, as you saw, so I leaped ahead a few. It is really wonderful to see his whole talk and to see the transformation and to imagine him going through all these stages. In the same talk, Ali Abu Awad speaks again, and he says, hey, we're not here to complain and cry and create guilt. We are here as messengers of a solution. There is a bigger truth that we both discovered, a truth that says millions of people who live in the Holy Land today, it's not their destiny to keep dying. There is one fact, he says, not the Palestinians and not the Jews will give up their rights. We will even fight until the last drop of blood for our existence, because this is the only place where we can both exist. That's a fact. And actually, no one wants us. We don't want to leave to anywhere, but no one wants us. If anyone thinks that one of both sides is going to disappear or has to disappear, that is a big mistake. So for reflection, we continue to think, how can we work for the well-being of both peoples? How can we change the conversation in the US or anywhere to a more civil and productive form of discourse? And what courses of action could involve mainstream Jews and Palestinians and Presbyterians that is pro-solution and not pro-one side? It's tremendously, tremendously difficult, and we haven't achieved it. Here in our Chicago dialogue, we have separate dialogues with the Jewish community and dialogues with the Muslim community. When there was a demonstration that was a Muslim organized pro-Palestinian rally, I talked with our Muslim partner, well, can we have a conversation involving some Jews too, or get a rabbi? And she said she spoke with the rabbi and they agreed not to talk about it. So, we have this tension and this peace, but how can we learn to talk about it? It is super hard. So, this is a huge thing that people have been fighting about and struggling with for decades, at least decades, and probably more. And we just are touching the surface, and I'm trying to bring to you concepts and language and perspectives and think about different angles so that we all can maybe become a little more conversant and understand what some of the passion is that comes out around this issue. So, what are your thoughts? Ken?
Yeah, I have no answers, obviously, but, you know, I love the film clip that you just showed with the rabbi. It was very impactful. I wasn't really liking where he was in the beginning, but as he told us, hold on, and you may like where I end up, and I did. You know, when you, it's a complicated thing because, you know, God tops everybody. So when you get to claim that God gave you something, that's a hard argument to actually have with people who God didn't give something to. You know, it would be great if we could, all black people from all over the world, could diaspora back to Africa and say, all white people go away because guess what? God gave us this. But we can't do that. And so, but they can. But I think, even though I know that we Christians came from that, I think claiming that is a distraction to the real conversation that has to happen. And it has to center around equality for all people. If you're going to live together, everybody's got to be equal.
Yes.
And as I've said in the past, I have many Jewish friends. I have Muslim friends as well. This is a tough one. I just think that everybody needs to be treated fairly, equitably, with justice for all. And just because you have courts and you have laws, heck, we completely ignored the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment for 200 years. Just ignored it. And upheld that ignoring, even in the highest court, SCOTUS. So those things don't really matter. Again, distractions in my mind, because it really boils down to how people are treated, how they interact. And again, I think personally knowing people is really the thing that makes you understand.
Yes. That is one of the things that I admire about the work of Roots. They call it the pre-political work. They're doing the pre-political work of breaking down the hatred, the anger, the fear, so that these two peoples could live together in peace and justice. Yes. I'm going to go with Charlotte and then Leroy.
I can see how much the conversation has changed. When I was the 67 war, I was in high school, I was in New York then. I don't remember anybody thinking the Palestinians had a just cause then. So maybe it was Jimmy Carter that helped move along the Palestine, maybe it was Vanessa Redgrave, I don't know. But there are more people willing to say now that the Palestinians have a good argument, not that they should win, but I think it has changed a lot in my lifetime.
Yeah. It would be good if both peoples could win, right? And there.
I shouldn't have used the word win, but both sides have rights.
Rights, yes, and a valid claim on sovereignty on this land. Thank you, Charlotte. Leroy.
Yeah, I was just going to point out that God may have given the land to the Hebrews, but the United Nations in 1947 gave land to the Palestinians also. And they said, this is yours, to the Israelis, used to be called Israelites in the olden days. This is your land and this is the Palestinians' land. The settlers, which we hear about and talk about, and what the settlers are doing to the land that the Palestinians are on, was given to the Palestinians by the United Nations. So there's the conflict. Does a particular religious orientation decide what is their land, or does the United Nations decide whose land is what land, like they did with every other nation after the Second World War?
Yeah, I would even say God gave the land to the Palestinians too. In much the way that Ken talked about God giving the land of Africa to black humans.
The fact is that the settlers are continuing, of course I have to throw in with United States money, are continuing to settle lands that, according to our form of government in our world at this time, was given to the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. And they're driving villagers and other folks who have lived on that land, farmed that land, planted the olive trees, etc., burning the olive trees, etc., and putting settlements there.
Yes, injustices that you are describing. I mean, when we think about the British mandate and giving certain land to a new nation and certain land to Palestinians, I mean, there's a question there too, like who decided that? Who decided that the Jews would not have Judea and Samaria but would have this other part of the land? You know, like the peoples who wanted their homeland there, it doesn't seem like we're part of that conversation at all. How could it have been differently if more voices had been at the table? If it wasn't such a colonial, empire-driven kind of situation at that moment? I'm probably backing myself into all kinds of corners, but that's just to show like how complicated it is.
When the Israelis took over the land the United Nations gave to them, they did to villages, literally destroyed them, drove the people off from the villages that they and their ancestors had lived on for thousands of years. They did exactly to some of the people what the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians today.
And if we heard more of Rabbi Schlesinger speak, he would talk about how he came to the realization that his victory was a tragedy for Palestinians, something that is recognized when we have Israeli Independence Day and the Day of Catastrophe. The Palestinians call it the Day of Catastrophe, the Nakba, and the Israelis call it the Day of Independence. It's a catastrophe and independence, and there's tragedy in that.
I think there's something that somehow we're incapable of understanding. I've heard Judaism called a religion of real estate because they're so fixated on the land. It's all over the Bible. The only other group I can think of like that is maybe the Native Americans, the Indians, are attached to sacred lands, and how dare you build an oil refinery? This is where our ancestors. We've heard that a lot, but I don't think any Presbyterians really just long to be in the steps of John Calvin we just don't get it.
How about the steps of Jesus? Who wants to walk where Jesus walked? Anybody? Maybe nobody feels that way. Okay, I feel that way a little bit. I have a little bit of a...
Steps on the south end of the temple where Jesus is supposed to have been on those very steps. It's neat to be
There's
there.
something cool about that. But yeah, I don't have a sense of connection to homeland. I don't have a sense that that's my home or that that's where my identity was created. And I think Christians have taken that sense from the Jewish tradition and we have spiritualized it. And we've made the promised land into something that's not land. We've spiritualized it and made it more universalistic, that there's a promised land that's more like a spiritual experience or something. That's a difference from how Jews have lived into that idea. Ken?
I love what you just said because that's the distraction that I spoke of earlier. If we speak through the Bible and God gave them the land, there is no higher authority. It's their land. But that's a distraction to the reality because we've made it bigger than land. It's a spiritual thing that belongs to the Jews in many people's minds. And if that's the case, then as Craig said, do the Native Americans have the right to give us back the $24 and take Manhattan? So, I just think it's a very, Craig, it's a very similar situation in my mind, and it's a page from the book of mankind taking things that they want, and not regarding the folks that were there before. And I think it's one thing that you can settle there, belong there, it has meaning to you, but again, you have to live with the others. And that's the conversation, I think, and not so much the biblical conversation.
And I must say that there are many Jews and many Israelis and many Israeli Jews who agree with all of that and who see that Israel as a nation is failing to do that. They're failing to live in peace. They're failing to build a nation that's sustainable and enduring. I think the Peace Now slide that I showed kind of attested to one example of that. So by showing a settler, I gave a certain spin, but I don't want to say that it's all the settlers, and I don't believe that God gives Israel right to do anything. You know, we can claim that God gives us the right to harm other people. I don't find that a compelling argument, or to take things from other people. I don't find that compelling. I don't believe that's true of God. But it's important for me to understand the experience of Rabbi Schlesinger as a Jew, and to understand that his experience of home is very different from mine. I think it's probably more similar to what some Palestinians are feeling right now. And when they start to talk about that with each other, they get a deeper sense of empathy, compassion, connection with each other, and develop a stronger commitment to working together for peace. Now, that's the people living in the land. There are also politicians, and there are also people who work with malevolence and manipulation and domination. And that's true in our country as well as every country. To go back to Les's point about why do I think that Israel proper is different from apartheid, if they're not living up, if they have human rights abuses, isn't that the same as apartheid? Well, I was thinking about our country. Like, we have human rights abuses, we have a mass incarceration problem, we have voting rights violations and laws, but I don't think we have apartheid here. I think we have racism, absolutely. I think we have white supremacy. But I don't think it's apartheid, and I don't think we need to call it apartheid to take it seriously or to address it. That was the point I was making.
I was just going to say, so in preparation for this trip that we're going to take, I've been doing some extra reading too, and reading about the really early history in the area there. And there were people there before Jewish people. Yes. So there's a question, really, where did the Jewish people come from? Who are they really? Did they invade an area where there are already indigenous people living and displaced?
That's a great question, and we had Professor Ted Hebert with us at an orientation recently for people taking the trip, and he talked about there's a biblical account of the conquest of Canaan. But he said archaeology actually shows that there was never a conquest of Canaan, and that many of the Jewish people were actually there living in Canaan, but they created this story about how they conquered it and won it. So it's not clear. He actually said that archaeology is very clear that there wasn't a conquest of Canaan or an invasion of Hebrew people into the Canaanite land. Why would they tell that story? That's what he was reflecting on as a scholar. But it's to Ken's point, like, whoever was there first that's not gonna solve the problem or answer the question. Yeah. Craig, one last thing and then we'll wrap up. People have to go.
Decades ago, I watched a television program, Kenneth Park was the narrator of it, and it was archaeologists trying to find traces of the Exodus, having a hard time. Kenneth Park said, maybe we asked the wrong profession. We shouldn't have asked archaeologists, we should have asked priests. They know.
Well, thank you all so much for being here again. I'll see you next week. Have a great week.